profits.
The hospital group is also taking steps to aggressively reduce its dependence on Eskom due to increasing power outages and rising costs.
We'll be reducing our energy needs by some 35% over the next 10 years, and our cumulative savings of our forecast electricity bill will be in the region of R1 billion. So we're doing something very constructive about the challenges we're facing at the moment.
That's business news, weekdays at 6 p.m. on SABC News.
This is Media Monitor, and this is what television news is currently running with this hour. A high-level delegation led by State Security Minister David Mahlobo has visited the areas south of Durban where foreign nationals are under attack. 7 people have been killed over the past 2 weeks and over 2,000 foreigners have been forced to flee their homes. The delegation will now report back to President Jacob Zuma. Police and EFF protesters have clashed at the Paul Kruger statue in Pretoria. The party says they will continue protesting until the statue is removed, and they've given the city 7 days to respond to their demand. Looking at your sports news, the Bulls have beaten the Reds 43-22 to complete a clean sweep of Super Rugby victories over Australian sides. The Bulls' win followed victories in Australia for the Stormers and the Cheetahs. Well, let's have a look at other stories that are making headlines on other media platforms. Our SABC radio bulletin is currently running with the story.
Top stories at this hour: the Paul Kruger statue defaced yet again, and 2 motorbike riders killed in Johannesburg. With the news at 8, I'm Tabile Nwanta. Good morning.
SABC News Online is also leading with the following this hour. Well, a very good morning, and thank you for tuning in to another edition of Media Monitor and welcoming us into your homes. Now, Media Monitor is a platform where we discuss the news that made us talk, looking at stories from across all media platforms. This morning, we aim to pick your brain and encourage you to look for the story within the story. We also aim to deepen your understanding of the role of media in our democracy while creating more awareness among TV viewers, radio listeners, newspaper readers, as well as users of news websites and social media. And remember, to be part of our discussions today, you can call us on the following numbers. It's +27 11 714 6843, 714 6847, and 714 6857. Alternatively, you can interact with us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor. A very good morning to you. Let's welcome our guest this morning. We are joined by Mr. Matata Tsedu, who is a veteran journalist and former editor. Sir, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for being with us here on Media Monitor this morning.
No, thank you for inviting me.
All right, Mr. Tsedu, let's go ahead and look at all the stories that are making headlines this morning. It's the City Press, and the headline reads, EFF rips off its staff. The Sunday Times, taxman accuses Malema of lying. The Sunday Tribune, Durban family stopped on IS trip. The Sunday Independent, diabolical and secret SABC TV deal exposed. Let's have a look at other news headlines from across Africa now. Zimbabwe's Sunday Mail says Independence Day massacre foiled. All right, a very good morning. Mr. Tsedu, let's go straight into it. Let's start with City Press there. The headline strongly reads, the EFF rips off its staff. Now, basically here, a number of allegations have been leveled against the EFF by its own members. Among those allegations, the fact that the party dismisses workers verbally and only giving them a week's notice. They've also failed to register workers and pay their UIF contributions, just to mention a few. But City Press alleges that these workers in different provinces have now taken this matter to the CCMA. I think this is the 5th consecutive week, and I stand to be corrected there, Mr. Tsedu, that we're seeing EFF's financial woes in front pages. Yesterday, Dalimpofu chaired the EFF's National Disciplinary Committee. What do you make of the latest developments?
Well, at a different level, the EFF is finding itself in a bad media spot. They're used to being the initiators of all the stories, whether it's the fracas in Parliament or even with the statutes. But in this instance now, this is something that they have no control over as the leadership of the party. And what you're having is a young party that has all these branches all over the country. They've hired people, and probably those people were hired impromptu, you're given a job, and now suddenly maybe you're either not performing or you're belonging to some other of these little groups that are emerging within the EFF, and now you have to go and you have to go immediately, and they don't seem to be following a due process. If one is to believe the allegations that are in the documents before the CCMA that the City Press is referring to. So the party, it's unraveling in a way, and it's unraveling in different areas. There is this where your own workers are saying you're not treating us in terms of the Labor Relations Act. That's big. As a political party that says it defends the poor and it is behind the working class and all of that, the working class defense, it's embodied in the Labor Relations Act. So everything that has to be done that way. And then you have your membership in terms of senior people who are members of parliament who have now taken to Twitter and everywhere else and are making allegations, have now been fired, and they're saying they're not going anywhere. So they are going to remain in this space for some time.
Let's move on and look at the Sunday Times there. Funny, they're leading also with the headline there. Taxman accuses Malema of lying. This is the offspin that you were talking about just now, Mr. Tsedu. Here's another version of more allegations against the party leader now, Julius Malema. This time, his woes with SARS are set to continue after revelations that his source of income was actually misleading. SARS has now apparently reneged on their deal and slapped Malema with a further 14 million rand tax.
Yeah, and to be fair to the party, we have to separate Malema, the man, from the EFF, the party. This is now Malema's own woes as an individual. And according to the story that is in the Sunday Times, Malema indicated when he made the deal with SARS that he was going to pay a reduced amount, that he would pay this money, and he indicated where the money would be coming from. So in one instance, he says, Matata will pay 1 million for me. And when they checked, they found that the money that came, the million came, but it did not come from Matata. It came from Alicia. And why is Alicia paying for Julius? So these are the things that they're talking about. He also indicated that he was going to pay some of this money that would be coming from a trust that had been formed to assist him, but he's not a listed beneficiary in that trust. So it may sound like a small little detail, but a trust is a legal entity. It must indicate who is going to benefit before it is even registered. And nobody who is not registered it's supposed to benefit. But it gets worse for Julius, because when they looked into the coffers of this trust that is supposed to have paid some millions, they found that it has only 4,000 rands. And they're saying, so where did the 3 million come from suddenly? So they are going back and they're saying you lied, and therefore the deal that we made with you, it's off.
Let's move on there, Mr. Tsedu, to the Sunday Independent. And it boldly reads there, diabolical and secret SABC TV deal exposed. While the controversial 550 million rand 5-year deal is in the news again, Caxton and Media Monitoring Africa actually took the contents of the deal to the Competitions Tribunal. They are yet to make a ruling. But what do you make of the story today, Mr. Tsedu?
There are wider implications that obviously the organizations that are pushing this matter, including Media Monitoring, Caxton and SOS, the wider implications are that there are archival ownership issues around what the SABC owns as a public institution that at some point was the only institution that was recording the South African history. And now they've gone and signed a deal with MultiChoice. And in the understanding of the organizations that are fighting this deal, they are saying that that hands over control of this public asset to a private company, which is part of the Naspers group, and which will then benefit a private company. And it means that the South African public, as the owner of the archived material, then loses control over this matter. And that the thing was done secretly, and even the board was not informed. When some of the board members got to know about it, they then had issues, and some we know have even been kicked out of the board because of that. But when you look more closely at the deal itself, some of the things are exclusivity rights that are inherent in many contracts that people make between themselves. So, for example, MultiChoice is supposed to have a deal with the SABC that if this entertainment channel comes, they are not going to use that material with somebody else, but only on a platform owned by MultiChoice. That's like when you're selling a house and the estate agent says, I want sole mandate. That's really what it comes down to.
All right, and we're going to leave it there with our newspapers. Don't even think about touching that dial. We're back shortly after this.
That goal was outstanding.
Made so much dust that I couldn't see, and I hit a stone and we had a puncture.
Catch all these and more every day on Sports Live at 8:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Our guest this morning is, of course, Mr. Matata Tsedu, a veteran journalist and former editor. Now, there are also other interesting stories that didn't necessarily make the front pages. Let's have a look at them now. The Sunday Times burned alive an anti-foreigners rampage on page 2. Now, this story, Mr. Tsedu, very interesting. It's of course Andries Tatane's anniversary since he died in 2011. And this is basically a brief expose about what has happened ever since in terms of the investigations. What are your views on the follow-up of this story?
Are we talking about the story of the burning alive?
Yes, sir. As you can see, they're right behind us, burned alive in an anti-foreigner campaign. It's basically a follow-up of what has happened since his death in terms of the foreign debts and what's going on. Yeah,
this story is really about the now prevalent attacks on foreigners all over. And in Durban, a very horrific thing happened, which reminds us of the Mozambican guy who was burnt alive up here outside Johannesburg. And we see a situation there where these people wanted to rob a container, and when they couldn't get in, they set it alight, and these guys were inside. It's horrific. And it brings into question the issues around xenophobia and hatred for, and when we say hatred for foreigners, we are actually not being fair, because it is not hatred for foreigners, it's hatred for African foreigners. And that is really the core of it, which comes down to what could be seen as self-hate. Why do people just think that people from Mozambique or Ethiopia or Somalia are the ones that they should have problems with, and they don't have problems with white people who own businesses around this country? But we also need to understand the battle for scarce resources at the bottom pile of the economy. This is where people think, if this guy is now selling tomatoes, which I could be selling, why does he have to leave Somalia to come and sell tomatoes here? It's all very, very wrong.
And how it makes reference to what has happened in terms of South Africa dealing with the xenophobic attacks on South Africa. Do you think much has been done, Mr. Tsedu?
No, not much. And there are reasons why some of these things have not happened. Firstly, South Africa took an approach, or let me take one step back and say, when South Africans were going out of the country into exile, they did not get into areas and just live amongst people. There were refugee camps and all of those things. South Africa took the view that there were not going to be refugee camps. Foreigners who come into the country, for whatever reason, were going to be integrated into the communities. And this is where this comes from. But also at a political level and at political leadership level, the South African government has taken the view that this is not really xenophobia. It's just criminals and some people who are jealous of one another. So the approach in terms of solutions has not been towards dealing with xenophobia, but dealing with what is seen as a criminal element. And that is why it will keep coming up. But there is no doubt that there is a criminal element in all of this, because even people who have an issue with a clinic, when they finish their march to the municipal office, they then go and raid some foreign-owned shop, and you say, why?
Let's move on there and to Sunday Independence, page 4 there. New regulations to curb the scourge of fake degrees. Well, with this story, it says the South African Qualifications Authority has now put in new measures, or introducing new regulatory measures on the evaluation of qualifications, especially from overseas learning institutions. What do you make of this now, Mr. Tsedu?
Well, one has to accept that it is a positive development. Crooks will always be evolving new tricks to bypass the system. But the majority of the problems that this country has had to deal with were not from outside, were not claims from somebody saying, I got a degree from Leicester University, which may not exist. It was people like the former chair of the SABC board who said she got a degree from UNISA when she didn't. So whilst the qualification body is right in introducing these measures to deal with foreign qualifications, they need to look at how to deal with claims of false qualifications emanating from inside the country, because that is really the majority of fakes are happening at that level, where people are just saying, I have matric, because they are looking for some clerical job in government.
But does this mean that the problem is that rampant, Mr. Tsedu, that they had to instigate these new measures?
No, it is rampant, and what we have seen are really the high-profile cases of people like my dear friend Paulo and the COO of this institution. Hope it doesn't get you fired. The former chairperson of the board here, and a whole host of other high-profile people who have claimed to have qualifications that they don't have. But when you run an institution, I have run an institution, and you look at the amount of applications that come in when you are looking for somebody to do a specific job, you realize how easy it is for somebody to just say, I have matric, when they don't have.
And nobody follows up.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on now to the page 5 of the very same paper there, the Sunday Independent. SANDF mercenaries turning tide in Nigeria. I don't know if you've seen this story, Mr. Tsedu, but the article talks about how SOFREP, that is the Special Operations Forces Situation Report, it alleges that the mercenaries that are fighting in Nigeria should have the blessing of the South African government, while this was denied by senior officials, of course. The question is, are mercenaries on their own or under government guard? Should we really need to assist them in battles outside of South Africa, because these are said to be fighting Boko Haram?
Well, if the government gets to a point where it starts choosing who it will allow to go and fight outside, it becomes a problem. But they are already doing that, because Jewish people who live in South Africa are free to go and join the Israeli army and fight against the Palestinians and even kill them there, and there are no comebacks. But when other mercenaries, because that is really being a mercenary, when other mercenaries do this, they are dealt with by the law that says you are not supposed to go and get involved in external wars without indicating to the government what you're going to do, and if you get permission, then you can go. But the reality around the Boko Haram issue is that there are governments like Chad, Cameroon, and others who have put in their soldiers in there who are turning the tide. The idea that this tide is turning against Boko Haram because there are now some white South African mercenaries who are there, it's a narrative that is driven by a racist approach that wants to abrogate the success that is being achieved by these African armies to a group of South African white soldiers or mercenaries who may or may not even be involved in that war. We know that the Chadians and the Cameroonians and the Niger governments are in there fighting every day, and that is why this situation has changed.
Let's move on to the page 10. The Malawi police instructed to shoot criminals attacking albinos for their body parts. Now, this story also very rampant in Tanzania, Mr. Tsedu. It's a very serious and big story. Allegedly, even some politicians were said to have been advised to acquire body parts of those people living with albinism in order to help them with the upcoming elections. I mean, what are we going to do about this saga, Mr. Tsedu?
It's actually quite a sad story. That in this day and age, you find people who still believe that something like that can actually turn the tide of your luck, and that people have to be killed because of a condition in the skin. In Central Africa, you also have the issue with the pygmies, who are also quite an endangered species. Tanzania has taken serious steps. The President Kikwete has spoken quite at length around this thing, even saying almost in tears that it is damaging the image of Tanzania, which is actually true. So we see now that in Malawi, quite a number of people have already been killed since the beginning of the year, and that is why the Malawian government is saying we need the police to just deal very effectively with this sort of things. But at the end of the day, it's about education and people understanding what albinism is about, and that it doesn't mean anything more than a skin condition.
You see, people don't really understand that, Mr. Tsedu. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick ad break and we'll have more Media Monitor shortly after this break. Stay with us.
Art is a personal expression that evokes a flame from within.
Street art, it's a vast concept.
Dancing is one of the main art forms on the streets of Africa. Regardless of how it is done, the streets remain expressive. A passionate artist in the central business district of Johannesburg.
Yeah, I've been doing this it's been 7 years or 8 years now.
Brains lost control on what to do then. Words dispute in the mouth of a woman.
That's Kaleidoscope, Sundays, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
We're back as promised. Now, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe has expressed gratitude to South Africa for the trade relations that the two countries forged during his 2-day state visit this week. Let's have a quick look at this clip.
He came.
Public service and administration.
He saw. And in the end, he conquered the hearts and admiration of even those who claimed he was over the hill. Never in the recent history has anyone elicited so much laughter from such an august gathering.
If players said, I'm no longer willing to pay for the land, should we have just folded our hands and say, oh, Lord Almighty, I pray in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Goodness me, no.
Any emotions at all?
And as a parting shot in the last leg of his visit.
I don't want to say white man. Mind you,
But even in serious moments,
we in Zimbabwe did not know about roads until South Africa said they had someone called Rhodes in Cape Town. You may have the statue because that's where he began. South Africa forwarded to us when he was already a corpse. So we are looking after the corpse. You have the statue of him.
Well, to further understand the recent visit by Zim President Mr. Robert Mugabe to South Africa, let's extend a warm welcome to Mr. Levi Kwabato as well as Professor Sipho Sepe. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Thank you for being with us.
Yes.
We just saw the fun parts of the clips there. He's a very colorful character, but Gentlemen, in a nutshell, how will Mugabe's visit aid the two countries? Let's start with you, Professor, on South African side.
Well, there are three levels that these state visits almost take. One is at the presidential level, where you have head of state to head of state. Then you have the government at the leads, where you have bilaterals with ministers. Then you have meetings with business formations between South Africa and that country. So at the level of head-to-head, the head of state to head of state, there are issues that go beyond simply the countries, that deals with issues of peace and security in the region, peace and security in the continent, but also the issues of the multilateral associations. They find themselves in the Commonwealth, the UN, and the reformations of those things, and the transformation that should occur at that level. But there are also issues where you have head-to-head. You also have political relations. And if you look at what the visit was about, it was first about consolidating those relations. But secondly, it was about strengthening and promoting the potential of economic ties, and around a number of areas like mining, water, infrastructure, ICT, etc. Then you also have our business, who have their own concerns, who are also talking to the businesses in Zimbabwe. But most importantly, it's also about strengthening the trade relations, but also to looking at the barriers of trade, because there are issues that South African businesses have around the laws that are there in Zimbabwe. For instance, the act that deals with the indigenization and empowerment. It has been a major concern for South African businesses, but also for our country, but also other foreign investors. So how do you begin to deal with it? But what was interesting is that when you start looking at the pronouncement by the president of Zimbabwe, there's been also willingness to get into a level of flexibility. But as I was saying to my colleague here, that one thing you do not do with the Zimbabwean president, don't touch on threatening or challenging the sovereignty of Zimbabwe, because he becomes very strong. But like you say, he's a very colorful character or figure, but he's also a very senior person. And South Africa is one of those countries that have benefited a lot from Zimbabwe, especially during the difficult times. And somehow those relations continue to sometimes bedevil, but also makes it possible for us to have a discussion with them.
Let's hear from Levi. Levi, many said that this visit will only benefit Mugabe, and a lot of Zimbabweans, according to the survey, were very mixed up in terms of their reaction about what really this visit will do for them as Zimbabweans. Your views?
Right. So I think primarily what President Mugabe was looking for was legitimacy from the South African government, which is something that he has been struggling with within the region and within the continent and internationally, despite the fact of Zimbabwe being a SADC chair and also most recently AU chair. So that's primarily one thing. But also I think he realizes the importance of South Africa, the growing importance of South Africa in rescuing the Zimbabwe economy, and also in assisting in the political transition that has been quite protracted. You would recall that South Africa has played a major role, pre-crisis, and we are still in crisis mode at the moment. But through the facilitation of the Government of National Unity all the way to the 2013 elections. So there's a very strong political element to the visit as well that has not really been spoken about, but perhaps it's loud in its silence, as it were.
That's what I really want to ask. When you say political ties, what do you mean when our democratic systems are different?
Well, not so different, but you would agree with me that any political problem in Zimbabwe would naturally become a problem to South Africa as well, as an immediate neighbor. And we have seen so much of that happening in the past, 10, 15 years of the crisis. And it's incumbent then upon South Africa to take a very active interest in addressing the political crisis in Zimbabwe, for what threats it poses as well to the business interests, as the professor said.
Professor, the fact fact that Levi says that Mugabe was really seeking, legitimacy. Do you follow that view as well?
Well, I'm not sure about the issue of legitimacy, because when you become a chair of SADC and you also play such a major role, I think he's respected in his own right, and I also think that even the Zimbabwean opposition respect him in his own right. But what is happening now, and I think also you do not see an arrogant President Mugabe. You have also even the people who are in opposition. Actually, I sent to Levi, when I looked at the statement of their own part or organization, it talks about reaffirming their commitment to working with South African government, working with academics, communities, etc. And this is the new way of dealing with issues, where you engage rather than to be shouting. Actually, in South Africa, we're still shouting at each other, but the approach now is to say you find more solution when you enter into a dialogue than when you stand on the rooftops and take a bullhorn and find somebody guilty and all that. But what we are doing is that the problems of Zimbabwe are our problems. That's one of the things that both our president and the previous president, the president of Zimbabwe are saying. And it is only through working together. And I'm glad that at least the coalitions like Levi's coalitions are participating positively in encouraging more constructive dialogue, but also to resolve those issues. And as I said, for our case, we have a large number of Zimbabweans here, and we are still trying to deal with those issues. And if you look at the ministers, I mean, there was the debate between the Minister of Trade, the Mining, the Home Affairs, and all that, because even the prisoners, even the people who have to be deported, we have to handle it in such a way that it is sensitive to the issues of human rights and all that. So there are those issues, and of course, President Mugabe did indicate the issues of illegality, that those are issues that must also be resolved, but without undermining the political relations, because for him, the starting point is that remember where you guys come from, remember our contribution, and let's use that as a stepping stone to have these issues, help us to resolve whatever challenges we face.
So it's been long overdue, 21 years, Levi, would you say?
Oh yes, as a state visit, of course, President Mugabe has been here a number of times. But I think giving him a state visit, which is something that's born out of the South African government's expression of strengthening those good relations, is something that's very positive and quite significant coming in as it does under present circumstances. But I would like to agree with the Prof as well, to really say South Africa is a very active, has an active interest in Zimbabwe. The amount of Zimbabweans who are here, of course, there are debates around the figure, but we have a huge population. But we've also seen the Department of Home Affairs taking very progressive steps in trying to award permits and visas to Zimbabweans, so that they can also be able to participate in the economy and have a regular stay whilst in the country. So those are some of the very positive steps that have been taken by the South African government in strengthening the ties. And also, we hope that President Zuma will continue to impress upon then President Mugabe to effect some democratic reforms that are quite needed in the country, as it were.
So it should be a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship. Gentlemen, let's talk about those 3 agreements that were signed. How does it now translate to the everyday man, Prof, especially on South African side?
Well, I mean, not only those agreements, because you have to understand that there are many other agreements that are taking place. One, I mean, if you want to take specifically on the business, the platinum mining, there's a concern that Zimbabweans have actually raised about their own, or South African business have raised around the internationalization. And we've seen actually platinum Zimplat saying, yes, we agree with that. We'll allow Zimbabweans to have 51%, because ultimately they're operating in their own country, and then they dealt with how that will be cut, that 20% will go to the people or 10% and all that. They found a way of dealing with that. Then there's the issue of the migration aspect, actually how you deal with prisoners in transit. You remember, we also have a Bill of Rights here, which says you cannot take certain people when they might face a possibility of execution. So those are issues that we must actually, that talking about that are quite clear. The issues of environment, I mean, if you take environment, for instance, we now share what you call it in terms of the economy, where we talk about tourism. there's a link between their national park and our national park and the national park of Botswana and national park of Mozambique. So how do you deal with those issues? So materially, it's really about the economy. So the president of Zimbabwe was coming here to say, help us kickstart that economy. But they find in South Africa a willing partner.
And people just said he was here to look for money. Let's hear what people at home are saying. Outside Purist in KZN says, he spoke a lot of sophistry here in South Africa whilst Zim burns. What's your impression of the old statesman? All right, and of course, His Excellency Mabote Maboko says, it's very important that he retires from politics, as we might see that bringing changes in Zimbabwe. Sami J says, it's always all about him. He did not even address the long-suffering economic refugees. No time for them. Desale says 91 is the age of goodbye. I hope he said his last good. That's very, very nasty. But Levi, very quickly, your comments before we let you guys go.
Oh, yeah, I think with the agreements, our position is that we want South Africa to hold the Zimbabwe government to account, to really see that they are being implemented to the letter and that Zimbabwe is meeting its end of the bargain, as it were. Then would also like President Zuma to really focus on democratic reforms in Zimbabwe. We have an election that's coming in 2018. That's not too far. So you don't have to wait to see bodies in the street or to see violence. We don't want to see those ugly scenes again. And I think we've seen a bit of progression, but I mean, with recent abductions of activists and so on and so forth, threats to media freedom, it becomes an early warning system. So we'd really like to impress upon President Zuma to say, look, Zimbabwe is head of SADC, it's head of the AU. We really want to get the country back on track. So if they can at least agree or try to push each other on democratic reform, then it will be a great thing.
He is chairing the AU, so good luck to the president there. And Zimbabwe, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us here on Media Monitor this morning. That was Professor Sipho Siepe, as well as Mr. Levi Kwabato, talking to us about the recent visit by Zim President Robert Mugabe. And when Media Monitor returns, we're going to analyze the debacle of the removal of statues. You have to stay tuned for more after this break. Welcome back. Well, the statue of British colonialist Cecil John Rhodes has been removed from its prime location at the University of Cape Town's upper campus. Now, the removal is the result of an intense campaign by the university students calling for transformation at the university. Professor, Mr. Tsedu, Rhodes has fallen. I know I've been speaking to Professor Siepe there. Look, Rhodes has fallen. More statues have been defaced.
I don't want the qualifications authority to start checking on my
apologies, Ntate Tsedu. Let's move on. Look, Rhodes has fallen. More statues have been defaced. More protection has been put up around some statues. But let's really understand, what is the symbolism of these statues?
Well, I think one of the people who really, for me, put it more succinctly was Ndlozi from the EFF, who was answering the question, why? What's the benefit of removing the statue? There are more serious issues like building houses and classrooms and stuff like that. Why bother about statues? And he was saying that the color and content of our public spaces determines how we interact with the public space. Now, when you you drive into a town, and at the entrance to this town, it's some old Boer soldier on horseback with a gun. It says you're entering that guy's space. It's not your space if you look like me. So what the students in Cape Town were saying was that statue sitting where it was sitting, in the manner in which it was sitting, was coloring that public space. But they also had deeper issues around curriculum and other transformatory issues that relate to the University of Cape Town. But let's stick to just the statues. So it is important that when change happens, it manifests itself in the public spaces in which we come. That is why all these people who would now be saying why worry about Cecil John Rhodes is just concrete, would have cheered when Saddam Hussein's statue was being brought down by the change that was happening at that time. The same people would have brought down some English statues in this country because they felt they were now in power. So it is important to understand that there is a psychological issue around how you relate to a place and whether it talks to you too. And that doesn't mean that there is no place for statues of white people. It just means that as Matat, when I walk into Cape Town or into Joburg, I should also be able to see myself reflected in the history, whether it's past or present, of the place where I am. Yeah. You can't have a situation where in a city in Africa, all the statues that you look around and see are of Europeans. I mean, that is a hell of a disjuncture. And there are issues around how the process is unfolding, the defacing and all of that, which is wrong. But the blame must go to the ANC government. 21 years they sat on their laurels and didn't think that it was important to deal with this issue. It has now been thrust onto them. They are going to have to deal with it. Maybe people were much more concerned about getting into office and getting their Range Rovers, but now they are being told the Range Rover, it's not as important as that concrete that is sitting over there.
Mr. Tsedu, look, democracy and freedom, where did it stem from? And then what is the liberation of the mind if we don't understand and accept who we are and where we come from?
Well, Black Consciousness and Steve Biko in particular said the liberation of the mind was actually a prerequisite for physical liberation, because if you are still oppressed in your mind, even if the chains are removed, you will still remain chained. And that is why an example is used of a goat that is kept for a month chained around a tree. You go and take the chain away, it will still hang around there because it thinks the chain is still there. In its mind, it hasn't internalized the removal of the chain. So this whole process that is going on now, it's an important psychological liberation movement that is actually happening, which should have been driven by government from 1994. They didn't, and now the chickens are actually coming home to roost. For me, it is quite ironic that the ANC and ANC government has now to run around trying to clean statues of some colonialists, putting police to protect statues of some colonialists. when this process could have been handled much more differently had they realized that the psychological liberation of South Africans from over 300 years of colonialism was very important.
So it's all part of the transformation that began in 1994, Mr. Tsedu. That's what you're saying. Let's look at the tweets that people at home have sent us on this topic. Tagzine Roberts says, what's the one use if doing all that? Shouldn't we just focus on building this country than destroying these statues? Maxi Price says SA is falling apart. After removing all these statues, also remove that the fact of South African history from the people's minds, which is what we've been currently debating in studio. Bongani Gumbi says government is reactive all the time. This should have been debated when struggle icon statues started to be re-erected. And of course, Chantal says, was part of our history. This country is just too childish and hungry for revenge. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with some of the things that are being said there. I obviously do not agree with the notion that we should just leave things as they are, because the perpetuation of the status quo is this perpetuation of a South Africa that is not African, but that is near Africa, and which is why people like that would say when they go to Zimbabwe, I'm going to Africa, as if they live somewhere else. Now, the removal of these statues speak to that point. You need to Africanize this country, integrate it back into the continent, because it has for many years been dealt with by those who had chosen to rule it, as if it was just some European piece that happened to be hanging around this continent. We are not a piece of Europe hanging around Africa. We are African, and it is important that South Africa looks, smells, and feels like an African country.
Mr. Tsedu, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for being with us here on Media Monitor this morning.
That's fine.
All right, well, that's where we leave it. I cannot believe it's that time again when I have to remind our viewers that your contributions and suggestions are highly valued. Remember to get in touch with us. You can always follow us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor. You can always share your views and comments on Facebook. Go to www.facebook.com/Media Monitor and like our page. You can also email us your views about the show. The email address is mediamonitor@sabc.co.za. Thank you for watching Media Monitor. Do join us again next week. Just in case you missed this live show, remember you can still catch the repeat broadcast tomorrow morning at 2 a.m. Alternatively, go to our SABC YouTube link on www.youtube.com/SABC News. For myself and the QTIV team, it's a blessed Sunday, but I'll be back with M News on top of the hour. Stay with us.
Let us go to this dolus issue, dolus eventualis and dolus director. What do they actually mean to the ordinary man in the street?
A practical and easy example of dolus eventualis is where two robbers walk into a bank with the intention to rob the bank. They reconcile themselves that should the teller press the panic button, they are going to pull a trigger and kill